What do you do when the most feared man in the city falls to his knees? Not from a bullet, not from a blade, but from the disappearance of the woman carrying his child. Damian Voss built his empire on silence, fear, and the kind of loyalty that only money and terror can buy. He never broke. Not once. Until the night Elena vanished, and the only person left who knew the truth was the woman he blamed for destroying everything he ever loved. This is the story of a man who controlled the world, but could not hold on to the one thing that mattered. If this story hits you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Part 1. The night. Everything he built collapsed. The rain started around 9 and hadn't let up since. Damian Voss stood at the window of his penthouse on the 43rd floor, watching the city below drown in sheets of gray water. The lights blurred, the streets emptied. Down there, the city looked like every other city. Anonymous, indifferent, slightly dangerous. Up here it looked like something he owned. He told himself that often enough that he'd stop needing it to feel true. Behind him, the apartment was quiet in a way that felt wrong. Not peaceful quiet, the kind of quiet that sat in your chest and pressed. Elena had been home all week. She'd been home for the last 6 weeks, actually, the pregnancy too far along for her to do much else. And Damian had grown used to the small sounds she made. The creak of the chair in the reading room, the low television volume she preferred, the way she hummed without realizing it when she was concentrating on something. He didn't hear any of that now. He turned from the window. Elena. Nothing. He walked through the main room, past the kitchen island where her tea mug sat half full and cold, past the hallway where her cardigan hung on the hook by the bathroom door. The bedroom door was open. The bed was made. The reading room? Empty. He checked the second bathroom. The small room they'd converted into a nursery 3 months ago, pale green walls and a second-hand rocking chair Elena had insisted on keeping, even though he'd offered to buy her an entire furniture store. Empty. 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 He pulled out his phone and called her. It rang through to voicemail. He called again. Same result. He texted. The message sat there, unread, the 2 gray check marks mocking him from the screen. He told himself not to panic. Elena was a grown woman. Maybe she'd needed air. Maybe she'd gone down to the lobby. Maybe one of her friends had picked her up without telling him. She did that sometimes, moved through her own life in spaces he didn't have access to, which was something he respected, and something that also, occasionally, made the muscle behind his ribs clench in a way he didn't like to examine. He called the front desk downstairs. Mr. Voss. Marcus, the night concierge, had the practiced calm of a man who'd been well paid to develop it. What can I do for you? Mrs. Voss, did you see her leave tonight? A pause. Too small to mean anything, probably. Yes, sir. Around 8:15. She took the elevator to the garage. Was she alone? Another pause, this one longer. There was a car waiting for her, a black SUV. I didn't recognize it, but she seemed to know the driver. She got in without any hesitation. Damian's jaw set. Plates. I didn't note them, sir. I apologize. Pull the garage footage and send it to my phone in the next 10 minutes. He hung up before Marcus could respond. He stood in the nursery doorway for a moment. The rocking chair sat in the corner, still and useless. A small mobile hung above the empty crib. Tiny wooden stars that Elena had painted herself, pale yellow and white, strung on thin silver wire. She'd spent an entire Saturday afternoon on those stars. He'd watched her from the doorway, the same way he was watching now, and he'd felt something shift in him that he hadn't had words for then and still didn't have words for. His phone buzzed. The garage footage. He watched it standing in the hallway, one hand braced against the wall. The timestamp read 8:13 p.m. The elevator doors opened and Elena walked out, moving slowly, one hand on her lower back the way she did when the baby's weight was bothering her, the other hand carrying a small tote bag. She was wearing the gray coat he'd bought her last winter. Her dark hair was loose. The SUV was already waiting. The driver got out. Male, medium height, dark jacket, cap pulled low. He opened the rear door. Elena looked at him for a moment, 2 seconds, maybe 3. And then she got in. She didn't look back. The car pulled out of the garage. The footage ended. Damian watched it twice more. Then he put the phone in his pocket and stood very still in his own hallway, in his own penthouse, in a building he owned, in a city he controlled, and felt the floor shift under him in a way it had no business shifting. He called his head of security, a man named Orrin Drake, who picked up on the first ring because Orrin Drake always picked up on the first ring. "Elena's gone," Damian said. "I need everything. Every camera between this building and a 5-mile radius. Every traffic feed. I need the plates on a black SUV that left our garage at 8:13 tonight, and I need it before midnight." There was a beat of silence on the other end, not the hesitant kind, the thinking kind. "I'm on it," Orrin said. "Are you calling the police?" Damian didn't answer that question. It didn't deserve an answer. The police in this city were either on his payroll, afraid of him, or both. Calling them would take longer than finding Elena himself and would involve a paper trail he didn't need. "Just move," he said, and ended the call. He went to his office, poured 2 fingers of bourbon, looked at it, and put it down without drinking. He sat behind his desk and opened the contacts on his encrypted phone. The one with no carrier name, no registered SIM, the one that didn't exist as far as any government database was concerned, and started making calls. He called Mace Holden, who ran his network of street-level intelligence across the waterfront district. He called Jin Park, who had a relationship with every traffic camera operator in the downtown corridor. He called 3 other men whose names it wouldn't be useful to record, and he said the same thing to all of them. Elena Voss. Pregnant. Missing as of 8:13 p.m. Black SUV. Unknown plates. Exiting from the Meridian Tower garage, heading south on Breck Avenue. Find it. By the time he'd finished the last call, Orrin was already texting him partial plate data. 2 letters confirmed from a street camera at Breck and Collier. XR. The rest was mud, bad angle, water on the lens. It wasn't enough. He sat back in his chair. The bourbon was still there, untouched, the ice slowly dissolving. He looked at the city through the office window. Same view as the living room, same drowning lights, same indifferent rain. And he tried to think clearly. Elena had walked to that car without hesitation. That was the detail that kept snagging on something. She hadn't been dragged. She hadn't looked frightened. She'd moved slowly because she was 36 weeks pregnant and everything hurt. But she'd gotten into that car like a woman who knew where it was going. Which meant either she'd agreed to go, which she hadn't mentioned to him, not a word, not a text, or someone had convinced her she needed to, which was a different kind of problem entirely. He thought about the last few weeks. He tried to be honest with himself, which was a discipline he'd developed late in life and still wasn't fully comfortable with. Elena had been quieter recently. He'd noticed it, but filed it under late pregnancy exhaustion. The dark circles, the way she fell asleep mid-sentence sometimes, the way she'd stopped asking him questions about work. He'd told himself that was normal. He'd told himself she was tired. He wondered now if she'd been afraid. He wondered what he'd missed. His encrypted phone buzzed. Unknown number, which meant it was routed through 4 different servers, and the person on the other end had gone to some trouble. He answered. Silence. Then breathing. Then a voice he hadn't heard in 3 years. "You need to stop making calls, Damian." He went completely still. The voice was low, controlled, with the particular quality of someone who had learned to speak carefully. Each word placed like a foot on uncertain ground. Vivian Cross. He hadn't said her name out loud since the trial. He hadn't let himself say it even in his head most days. She was a closed chapter. She was a scar he'd stopped touching. She was the reason his brother Marcus was serving a 20-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The reason his father had died believing the family name was ruined. The reason Damian had spent 18 months rebuilding an organization from ash. She was the last person on earth he expected to call him tonight. "Where is she?" he said. His voice was flat, not a question, a demand dressed in a sentence. "I don't have her," Vivian said, "but I know who does." "Then talk." "Not like this." A pause. "And not where you are. They're watching the building, Damian. They've been watching it for 2 weeks. If you make one more call from that phone, You're going to confirm exactly what they're waiting to confirm. He said nothing. He was doing math, angles, possibilities, the probability that this was a trap versus the probability that she was telling him something true. The problem was that both could be true at the same time. Vivian was good at that. She'd always been good at occupying two truths simultaneously. "Why are you calling me?" he said. Another pause, longer this time. He heard her exhale. "Because I owe her," Vivian said. "Not you. I don't owe you anything. But, Elena, that's different. And I'm not going to sit here and watch what I know is coming without giving you a chance to stop it." "What's coming?" "Come to the ferry terminal on the south end of Harwick Pier, the old one, the one that's been closed since the storm last spring. Come alone, come in something that isn't yours. And don't use any of your phones to navigate. 2 hours." She hung up. Damian sat with the deadline for a long moment. Then he set the phone down, very carefully, on the surface of the desk. He looked at his hands. They were steady. They were always steady. That steadiness was something he'd built deliberately over years, because the alternative, the shaking, the visible fear, the body betraying what the mind was trying to control, was something he couldn't afford in the life he'd chosen. He thought about Elena, the gray coat, her hand on her lower back, the way she'd gotten into that car without looking back. He thought about Vivian Cross and the 3 years of silence between them and all the things that silence had been built on top of. He stood up. He put on a jacket he kept in the closet for situations that required anonymity. Dark, unremarkable, no labels. He took a burner phone from the second drawer of his desk and pocketed it. He left the encrypted phone on the desk, screen down, as Vivian had implied. He took the service elevator to the parking level below the main garage, where he kept a nondescript gray sedan registered to a shell company 3 layers removed from his name. He drove south through the rain. The city thinned out as he moved toward the waterfront. The downtown grid gave way to older streets, wider, emptier, the kind of blocks where the buildings had stopped pretending to be anything other than what they were. Warehouses, freight depots, a few bars with neon signs that had been the same neon signs for 30 years. The rain was heavier down here, or maybe it just felt heavier because there was less overhead cover, less glass and steel to break it up. He parked 2 blocks from Harwick Pier and walked the rest. The ferry terminal had been an actual working terminal once, the kind of place where commuters crossed the bay in the early morning and came back at dusk, coffee in hand, watching the water. The storm the previous spring had taken out the main dock and flooded the lower level, and the city had fenced it and forgotten it in the way cities forget things that don't have enough votes or enough money to demand remembering. The fence was chain link, padlocked, with a no trespassing sign that was already starting to rust. Damian found the section of fence that had been pulled loose at the base and bent it back far enough to squeeze through. Inside, the terminal smelled like salt and rot and standing water. The main hall was dim. Some ambient light came in through windows that had lost half their panes to the storm, and a few emergency exit signs still glowed in the darkness, running on backup power that probably had another 6 months in it before it gave out. The floor was warped, the tiles buckled up in places where water had gotten under them and frozen and thawed over the winter. Old departure boards still hung from the ceiling, the letter flip kind, frozen midward on routes that would never run again. He heard her before he saw her. Footsteps from the far end of the hall, measured, unhurried. Vivian Cross walked into the ambient light from one of the broken windows, and Damian looked at her for the first time in 3 years. She was thinner. Her face was sharper at the jaw, harder at the eyes. She was wearing a dark raincoat that was wet at the shoulders, her hair pulled back, and she was carrying nothing. No bag, no phone visible, nothing in her hands. That last detail was deliberate. She wanted him to see she wasn't holding anything. She stopped about 10 feet away from him. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a lot sitting in that silence. 3 years of it, plus everything that had come before the 3 years, plus the specific damage that particular history had done to both of them in ways neither would have been willing to fully inventory. "You look like hell," she said. "Tell me something I don't know," he said. "Starting with who has Elena." Vivian's jaw moved slightly, like she was working up to something she'd rehearsed but still found difficult. You remember a man named Carver Lent. Damian's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes shifted. He's dead, 2 years ago. Boat accident in the Adriatic. He's not dead, Vivian said. The accident was staged. He's been operating out of a private facility in the industrial corridor north of the city. He has about 40 people working for him. He's been rebuilding for the last 18 months. Rebuilding what? His claim to everything you took from him. She paused. He lost his distribution network when you moved against the Lent family in 2021. He lost his money, his contracts, his people. He spent 2 years building a new identity in Europe and another year figuring out how to come back. And when he came back with a plan. And the plan involves my wife. The plan is leverage, Vivian said. He doesn't want to fight you. He knows he can't fight you. He wants to trade. Elena, safe for your signature on a territory agreement that gives him back the southern port operations. Damian looked at her steadily. And you know all of this because 6 months ago someone approached me on his behalf. She held his gaze. They thought I'd be interested, given our history. And were you? I told them no. But you didn't come to me. Her mouth pressed into a thin line. No, I didn't. Why? The word landed between them like a stone dropped into water. Clean, simple, with a lot of ripple behind it. Vivian exhaled. Because I wasn't sure you'd believe me, and because... She stopped, started again. Because I wasn't sure I'd done enough damage to your life already without walking back into it. Damian said nothing. He looked at her. He was doing what he always did in conversations that mattered, logging everything, the micro-expressions, the tells, the places where the body contradicted the words. He'd been doing it for so long it was automatic. And what it told him now was that she wasn't lying. She might be omitting things, she might be editing, but the core of what she was saying was true, or true enough to act on. How long has Lent had her? He said. He made contact with her this morning, Vivian said. Someone she trusted, or someone who presented themselves as someone she trusted. They told her you were in danger, that she needed to be moved somewhere safe while you handled a threat. She believed them. She went willingly. Damian absorbed that. The garage footage. Elena getting into the car without hesitation, without looking back. Because she'd thought she was protecting him, because someone had weaponized her love for him against her. He felt something hot and controlled move through his chest. Where is she now? He said. I don't know the exact location, but I know the general area. A cluster of industrial properties north of the Crane Street corridor, off-grid, not on any current lease register. I have photos. She reached slowly into her coat and produced a folded envelope. She held it out toward him. Before you take that, you need to understand something. Lent's people have been watching your organization for months. They know your inner structure. They know your communication protocols. They know who reports to whom and when and through what channels. If you move your usual people, he'll know within hours and Elena's situation becomes significantly more dangerous. Damian took the envelope. He didn't open it yet. He was looking at her. You said you owe her. Yes. How do you even know her? Vivian's expression did something complicated. A flicker of something that might have been grief, or guilt, or both, moving through features that had learned to keep most things at a distance. About a year after everything happened, after the trial, after I left the city, I was in bad shape. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't. I was in bad shape and I made some poor choices, and I ended up in a situation that required someone to help me out of it. She paused. Elena didn't know who I was. I was just a woman in trouble. She helped me anyway. She's that kind of person. I know what kind of person she is, Damian said quietly. Then you know why I'm here, Vivian said. He looked down at the envelope in his hand. He opened it and leafed through the photographs inside. Aerial shots, distant shots, what looked like printouts from satellite imagery. A cluster of low industrial buildings behind a freight depot, surrounded by chain link and floodlights. One building larger than the others, newer construction, the kind of thing that could pass as a storage facility. This is from tonight, he said. It wasn't a question. The imagery was too current. I've had eyes on it for 3 weeks, Vivian said, since I figured out what Lent was planning. And you sat on it for 3 weeks. I was trying to find another way to handle it, a way that didn't involve coming to you. He looked up at her. There wasn't another way. No, she said. There wasn't. The rain against the broken windows was steady and loud, and the old ferry terminal held the sound in its high ruined ceiling and gave it back amplified. Damian stood in the dim light of it and looked at the photographs and thought about Elena, 36 weeks pregnant in some cold building north of the Crane Street corridor, told by a stranger that her husband was in danger, waiting for something to resolve itself. He thought about the nursery, the rocking chair, the painted wooden stars. He thought about Vivian Cross, who had destroyed his family 3 years ago and now stood 10 feet away from him, rain-damp and careful and carrying information that might be the only thing standing between him and losing everything that mattered. He thought about Carver Lent, who was supposed to be dead and wasn't, which meant someone close to Damian had either been deceived or had lied. Either option was a problem. Either option meant the organization he'd spent 3 years rebuilding had a fracture in it somewhere, and he hadn't found it because he'd stopped looking. He'd stopped looking because he'd let himself believe the threat was over. He folded the photographs back into the envelope and put it in his jacket pocket. I need everything you have, he said. Everything you've observed for 3 weeks. Personnel, shift patterns, entry points, communication equipment, all of it. I know, Vivian said. She reached back into her coat, same careful motion, telegraphed and slow, and produced a small drive. She held it out. It's encrypted. The key is the date of the first night we met. You remember it. He remembered it. He took the drive. There's something else, she said. He looked at her. Lent isn't working alone. He has backing from inside your organization. She held his gaze. Someone who's been feeding him information for at least a year. Someone close to you. I don't know who. I've tried to narrow it down and I can't get there from the outside. But whoever it is, they knew Elena's schedule tonight. They knew when she'd be home alone. They knew when you'd be occupied. The weight of that settled over him like something physical. He'd known, in some abstract way, that this was a possibility. An organization his size, with the number of people who moved through it, was never perfectly sealed. There were always gaps. There were always people who had reasons, or thought they did. He'd always believed he could feel it when the loyalties shifted, the way an animal could feel weather. Apparently he'd been wrong. You said they've been watching this building for 2 weeks, he said. Yes. And you've been watching them for 3. Yes. Then you've seen who makes the contact, between his people and mine. Something moved across her face. I've seen a vehicle. I've tracked a phone. I haven't confirmed identity, but she stopped again. The hesitation was real. He could see her weighing something, measuring what she was about to say against what it would cost to say it. Tell me, he said. The vehicle is registered to a company that I can trace 2 steps before it disappears, she said. But one of those steps goes through a name you know, Prentice Holt. Damian went very still. Prentice Holt had been with him for 11 years. He'd started as a driver, young, serious, precise, and worked his way up through the organization with a combination of reliability and quiet intelligence that Damian had recognized and rewarded. He currently ran internal logistics, which meant he had access to schedules, personnel movements, safe house locations. He had access to Elena's security detail rotation. He had access to everything. I could be wrong, Vivian said. She said it carefully, not as a retreat, but as an acknowledgement. I want to be clear about that. This is inference, not confirmation. I know the difference, Damian said. He stood in the ruined ferry terminal in the rain-loud dark and thought about 11 years. He thought about a young man who'd driven him to a hospital in the middle of the night when Damian had taken a bullet in the side and refused to go to the emergency room, and who'd sat in the parking lot for 4 hours without being asked to and without saying a word about it afterward. He thought about trust, which was the rarest thing in his world and the most valuable, and about what it meant when something that rare turned out to have been something else all along. He thought about Elena, waiting. Go somewhere safe, he said to Vivian. Stay off your phone. I'll contact you in 12 hours. And if you don't, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then you'll know the situation deteriorated. He turned to leave. Damian? He stopped, didn't turn back. She's strong, Vivian said quietly. Elena. She's a lot stronger than people give her credit for. I need you to know that. He stood there for a second. The rain, the old terminal, the weight of everything that was wrong pressing down through the high ruined ceiling. I know what she is, he said again. He walked out through the dark. The drive back across the city was 40 minutes of silence and controlled breathing. He took a route that moved through 6 different neighborhoods and doubled back twice. Old habit, the kind of paranoid geometry that had kept him alive in situations that were supposed to end differently. He didn't use the burner phone. He didn't call anyone. He moved through the rain-soaked city with the photographs in his pocket and the drive and the name Prentice Holt sitting behind his teeth like something he'd bitten down on and couldn't yet spit out. He got back to the building through a secondary entrance on the east side, took the freight elevator, and arrived on his floor without going through the lobby. He went to his office and sat behind the desk and opened the laptop that was air-gapped, unconnected to any network, used only for storing sensitive documents locally. He inserted the drive. The files opened. 3 weeks of surveillance, organized with a precision that surprised him, not because Vivian had never been capable of precision, but because he'd spent 3 years trying to believe she was less than he'd always known her to be, and the evidence on this drive contradicted that effort on every page. Shift patterns, vehicle logs, communication frequencies, annotated photographs with timestamps and GPS coordinates, a timeline that traced Carver Lent's movements from his supposed death in the Adriatic to his reappearance north of the city, with sourcing notes on each data point. She'd been building this for months. He read through it for an hour. Then he closed the laptop and sat in the quiet office and looked at nothing in particular. Elena was out there in the dark in a building he could now locate on a map. She was 36 weeks pregnant. She was carrying their child, a child he hadn't fully prepared himself to love and had already, without meaning to, begun to restructure everything around. She was in the hands of a man who wanted to use her as a bargaining chip, and she probably still believed she'd gone willingly to keep Damian safe. And somewhere inside his own organization, in the body of the thing he'd built over 15 years, in the network of people he'd chosen and tested and elevated, there was a fracture. A person who had decided that what Carver Lent was offering was worth more than what Damian Voss represented. Prentice Holt. 11 years. He opened the desk drawer and took out a different phone, a third device, this one a single-use unit he'd never deployed. He held it in his hand for a moment. He had to move by morning. Every hour Elena spent in that building was an hour in which something could shift, Lent's patience could fray, the calculation could change. He couldn't use his normal channels. He couldn't trust his normal people. He needed to build something new from the inside out, tonight, in the next few hours, using only people whose loyalty he could stake his life on without any doubt. That narrowed the list considerably. He started making a mental inventory, names, histories, obligations, the specific texture of what he knew about each person. Who owed him something that couldn't be repaid any other way? Who had a reason to be loyal that wasn't just money? Who would pick up a phone at midnight and say yes without needing to be told the whole story? He was 3 names in when his office door opened. He looked up. Prentice Holt stood in the doorway. He was still in his jacket. He'd apparently been in the building, working late, which was characteristic. He often worked late. It had always been one of the things Damian had valued about him. His face was neutral. His hands were visible. He looked like what he'd always looked like, a reliable man in his early 40s, unremarkable in every way that counted, the kind of person who could move through a room and leave no impression. "Sir," he said, "I heard about Elena. Oren told me. I wanted to come and see if there was anything you needed." Damian looked at him. He kept his face exactly as it was. He kept his hands exactly as they were. He kept his breathing steady and his posture loose, and he held Prentice Holt's gaze with the same mild attention he might give to any man who'd just walked through a door. "Sit down, Prentice," he said. Something moved behind Holt's eyes. Very fast, very small. Not guilt exactly. More like the micro-adjustment of a man recalibrating. He sat down. Damian looked at him for a long moment. Tomorrow, he thought. By tomorrow morning he would know exactly who Prentice Holt was, and what he'd done and how deep the fracture went. And then he would know what it was going to cost to get Elena back, not in territory agreements or port operations, but in the specific coin of his own failures, the things he'd trusted that he shouldn't have, the vigilance he'd let slip because he'd let himself believe the worst was behind him. He looked at Prentice Holt, who looked back at him with the careful face of a man who didn't yet know that the walls were already closing. "Tell me," Damian said quietly, "what you know about Elena's movements tonight." Holt's expression arranged itself into concern, genuine-looking concern, the kind that required practice. "Only what Oren shared with me," Holt said, "that she left the building around 8, that the car wasn't one of ours." Damian nodded slowly. His hand rested flat on the desk, relaxed, open. "That's all?" he said. "That's all I know," Holt said. Damian looked at him. Outside, the rain kept falling. Prentice Holt had a tell. Damian had known about it for years, had filed it away the way he filed everything, in the part of his mind that didn't discard things just because they currently had no use. When Holt was under pressure, real pressure, not the manufactured stress of a deadline or a logistics problem, but the specific pressure of something at stake that he couldn't control, his right hand moved to his left wrist. Not a scratch, not a fidget. A light touch, 2 fingers against the pulse point, lasting maybe half a second before he caught himself and stopped. He did it now. It was so fast that a less attentive man would have missed it entirely. Damian didn't miss it. He watched it happen and kept his own face exactly where it was, mild, tired, a man who'd had a bad night and was working through it, and said nothing for a moment. "Oren called you," Damian said. "That's right. What time?" Holt didn't hesitate. "Around 10. Maybe 10:15. Damian nodded. He made a small sound, not agreement, not disbelief, just acknowledgement, the kind of neutral noise that invited the other person to keep talking without giving them anything to navigate by. He'd learned that from his father, who'd been better at it than anyone he'd ever met. "And you came straight here," he said. "I was already in the building," Holt said, "working late on the Mariner Street numbers. Oren caught me on my way out." "Right," Damian said. He let the silence sit. Holt was good. He didn't fill it, didn't rush to explain himself further, didn't make the mistake of over-explaining that guilty people made when they'd prepared too thoroughly for a conversation they'd expected to go differently. He sat with the silence like a man with nothing to hide, which was exactly how a man with everything to hide would sit if he was very good at it. Prentice Holt was very good at it. "I'm going to need you to do something for me tonight," Damian said. "I need you to go back to the Mariner Street office and pull every movement log for Elena's security detail going back 6 weeks. Physical copies. Don't use the network drive. Pull the hard backups from the filing cabinet in the secondary room. Bring them here by 2 a.m. Holt's expression did the thing it was supposed to do. Slight furrow, professional concern, the look of a man organizing a task. "Of course, should I bring Drake in on this?" "No," Damian said. "Just you. I need this quiet." "Understood." Holt stood. "I'll have them to you by 2. Damian watched him leave. He listened to the sound of footsteps down the hallway, the elevator, and then nothing. He sat for exactly 30 seconds. Then he picked up the single-use phone and made the first call on his short list. The man who answered was named Theo Cassell, and he had worked for Damian in a freelance capacity for 9 years. Not inside the organization, not on any payroll, not in any filing system. He was the kind of person who existed in the spaces between organizational structures, the gaps where official channels couldn't reach and unofficial ones could. He was also the only person Damian was currently certain of, because Theo Cassell had never been introduced to Prentice Holt and had no way of being in Lent's intelligence picture. "I have a problem," Damian said. "Tell me," Theo said. He sounded awake. He always sounded awake. "I need a tale on someone leaving my building in the next 5 minutes. Dark jacket, 42 years old, gray at the temples, drives a Navy Audi. I need to know where he goes and who he contacts tonight. And I need to know what this is worth. Name it later. Can you move now?" "I'm already moving," Theo said and hung up. Damian set the phone down and pulled out the photographs from his jacket pocket. He spread them on the desk. The aerial shots of the industrial compound north of Crane Street, the distance shots of the single larger building. He'd looked at them in the ferry terminal, but he looked at them again now, differently, with the specific attention he gave to problems that had to be solved under time pressure. One main structure, two access roads, both visible from the perimeter, floodlights covering the south approach, less coverage on the north side where the older warehouse abutted the new construction and created a shadow corridor roughly 8 meters wide. He counted vehicles in the photographs, 4 spread across 2 different shots, suggesting a rotation. Vivian's surveillance notes on the drive had given him shift times. The overnight crew was smaller, 3 to 4 people. He could work with 3 to 4 people, but he needed bodies he could trust, and the list of bodies he currently trusted had just gotten significantly shorter. He thought about Orrin Drake. Orrin had been with him for 7 years, so shorter than Holt, but not short. He'd been the one to call Holt tonight, which could mean nothing, which could mean something. He tried to think of a reason Orrin would have called Holt specifically, out of everyone, and couldn't find one that sat cleanly. He pulled up the internal contact sheet on the air-gapped laptop and went through it the way he'd gone through the photographs, looking for the shadow corridors, the unlit angles, the places where something could move without being easily seen. 3 names. That was what he came down to. 3 people inside his own organization, beyond Orrin Drake, whose status was currently uncertain, that he was willing to bet Elena's life on. Rafa Mendez, who ran the East Side crew and had been with Damian since before Damian had anything worth running. Mara Sung, who handled communications and whose loyalty was rooted in something personal enough that he didn't think it could be bought. And Jin Park, who'd already been called once tonight and who Damian had known since they were young men making bad decisions in a city that rewarded bad decisions, which was a different kind of bond than professional loyalty. He called them one at a time. He told each of them the same thing. There was a problem, it was serious, he needed them in person. Come in a vehicle that wasn't registered to them. Come through the east entrance. Don't tell anyone. Each of them said some version of yes and hung up. None of them asked questions they didn't need answered yet. That was the thing about people who'd been through enough with you. They knew when the questions could wait. While he waited, he went to the kitchen and drank water, standing at the sink, looking at the counter where Elena's tea mug still sat. He didn't move it. He looked at it for a moment and then looked away and went back to the office. Rafa arrived first, 20 minutes later, short, solid, wearing a mechanic's jacket over whatever he'd been doing before the call, his dark eyes taking in the room with the particular alertness of a man who'd learned to read environments quickly. Behind him, 10 minutes apart, came Mara and Jin, both reading the same atmosphere and both going quiet with it. Damian told them everything. He gave them the short version, not truncated, just compressed, stripped of the emotional texture and delivered as operational data. Elena was gone. Carver Lent, not dead, holding her as leverage. A mole inside the organization, suspected identity but not confirmed. A location, a timeline that needed to start moving before dawn. He watched their faces as he talked. Rafa's jaw set and didn't move. Mara's expression went still in the way that meant she was running calculations. Jin looked at the photographs spread across the desk and said nothing until Damian finished. "Prentice," Jin said. He said it the way you say a word when you're tasting it for something wrong. "Suspected," Damian said, "not confirmed." "He called me tonight," Mara said, "around 9. He wanted to know what communication protocols Orrin had activated since you reported Elena missing." The room was quiet for a second. "What did you tell him?" Damian said. "That I didn't have that information yet." She paused. "I thought it was a strange question. Now I don't think it was strange. I think it was exactly what it looks like." Damian nodded. "I sent him on a task tonight that will keep him occupied until 2 a.m. By 2 a.m., I need to know what Theo Castle has found on his movements. And by 4 a.m., I want to be moving on this location." He tapped the photograph. 4 hours, Rafa said. It wasn't a complaint. It was a man measuring the geometry of what he was being asked to fit into 4 hours. "Elena is 36 weeks pregnant," Damian said. It was the first time he'd said it out loud tonight in a room with other people, and the weight of it was different when said aloud. Denser, more real, landing differently in the chest. I am not waiting for morning. No one argued with that. They worked through the next 2 hours at the desk. Vivian's surveillance data on the laptop, the photographs on the desk surface, Mara on a clean tablet running satellite imagery, Jin on a burner phone arranging equipment through a chain of contacts so removed from the organization that Lent's intelligence picture couldn't possibly reach them. Rafa said almost nothing. He sat with the photographs and the compound layout and built the approach in his head the way Damian had watched him build approaches for 15 years, methodically, almost peacefully, like a man assembling something he'd built many times before. At 1:40 a.m., the single-use phone buzzed. Theo Cassell. Your man went to the Mariner Street office like you said, spent 12 minutes inside. Then he drove to a parking structure on Fenwick, left his car, and got into a vehicle that was waiting for him. Blue panel van, no plates I could read. He was inside for 9 minutes. Then he came back to his car and drove back toward your building. The van, Damian said. Which direction did it go when it left? North on Fenwick, toward the freight corridor. The freight corridor, north of Crane Street. Damian pressed his thumb and forefinger against the bridge of his nose for a moment. He breathed. You have eyes on him now? He's in the parking structure on Breck, half a block from your building. My guess is he's going to walk in with those files right on schedule and play it straight. Don't lose him, Damian said. I don't lose people, Theo said, mildly offended, and hung up. Damian set the phone down and looked at the room. Rafa, Mara, Jin. 3 people who'd known him long enough that he didn't need to explain what his face meant right now. It's Prentice, he said. The confirmation sat in the room, and nobody reached for it immediately. There was a specific quality to the silence that followed a betrayal being verified, heavier than suspicion, different from surprise, carrying in it all the retrospective weight of every moment you'd trusted the wrong person and hadn't known it. Jin made a sound in the back of his throat. Not quite a word. 11 years, Rafa said quietly. Yes, Damian said. What do you want to do with him? Mara said. She asked it the way you ask a practical question, not cold, but focused, because the situation required focus and emotion could be afforded later. When this is over, Damian said, not before. Right now, Prentice Holt still thinks he's invisible. I want him to keep thinking that for the next 3 hours. He looked at the time, 1:47 a.m. I need to make one more call, he said. Give me 10 minutes. He went to the hallway, away from the office, and dialed Vivian's number from the single-use phone. She picked up on the second ring. She'd been awake. He could tell immediately from the quality of her voice, awake and waiting, which told him she understood the situation well enough to know that sleeping wasn't appropriate. Prentice Holt is confirmed, he said. A pause. I'm sorry, she said. I need to know if your surveillance identified any secondary access on the north face of the main structure. The satellite data shows a shadow corridor, but I need to know if it's viable. He heard her moving, papers maybe, or a laptop. Then, there's a loading bay on the north face, roll-up door, manual, padlocked from the outside. It was opened twice in the 3 weeks I watched the place. Once to bring in equipment, once to move a vehicle. The padlock is a Bricker 700 series. Your people will know what to use on it. How many guards on overnight? 3, based on my observation. 1 on the perimeter, 1 inside the main door, 1 mobile between the structures. The mobile guard runs a 14-minute circuit. I have the timing documented. I know. I read your files. He paused. You did good work, Vivian. The silence that followed that was careful and complicated. He hadn't meant it as anything other than what it was, a factual acknowledgement. But the history between them made every sentence carry freight it hadn't been loaded with intentionally, and he heard her receiving it in that complicated space. Is Elena going to be all right? She said. Yes, he said. He said it without hesitation, not because he was certain, but because certainty was the only option he was allowing tonight. Okay, she said. Okay, then go. He went back to the office. At 2:03 a.m., exactly as Theo had predicted, Prentice Holt walked through the door with a file box under his arm and the composed face of a man performing a task he'd been asked to perform. He set the box on the desk and stood back. "Everything from the last 6 weeks," he said. "Hard copies, like you asked." Damian looked at him. He looked at the box. He nodded. "Good," he said. "Thank you, Prentice. Get some sleep. I'll need you sharp in the morning." Holt nodded. He looked around the office, taking in Rafa, Jin, the papers on the desk, with an expression of professional concern that was seamless, completely seamless. And Damian thought about 11 years and felt something that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite anger, but existed in the terrain between the two. "I hope she's all right," Holt said. Damian held his gaze. "She will be," he said. Holt left. The moment the elevator sound faded, Mara said, "He looked at the photographs on your desk." "I know," Damian said. "He'll call Lent." "He already called them from the parking structure," Damian said. "Anything he saw in here goes to them in the next 20 minutes, which means our window just got shorter." He looked at Rafa. "How close are we?" "Equipment is staged 2 blocks from the target," Rafa said. "Jin's contacts delivered an hour ago. We can move when you're ready." "Then we move now," Damian said. "Mara Atborj, stay here. I need someone monitoring the communication frequencies from Vivian's file. If Lent's people start going active, I need to know before we're at the perimeter." Mara didn't argue. She pulled the tablet toward her and started configuring. Damian put on the dark jacket again. He checked the weight at his hip. An old reflex, nearly unconscious, the specific comfort of knowing something reliable was where it was supposed to be. He picked up the photographs and the drive and put them in his inside pocket. "One more thing," Jin said. He was looking at the desk, at the file box Holt had brought. "Do we actually know what's in there?" Damian paused. He hadn't opened it. He'd used it as a task to send Holt out of the building, not as a genuine intelligence request, and he hadn't thought past that function. He opened the box. The files were there: physical security logs, weekly summaries, personnel rotation sheets. He leafed through the top layer quickly. Then he stopped. Beneath the legitimate files, at the bottom of the box, was a single sealed envelope. No name on the outside. His hands were steady when he picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single photograph. Elena, sitting in a chair, a concrete wall behind her. She was holding a piece of paper toward the camera. On the paper, in her handwriting, large, clear, the handwriting of a woman who wanted to make sure it was legible, were 2 words: "I'm okay." And below that, smaller, "Don't trust." The photograph ended there, cut off. Whether deliberately or by the frame of the shot, he couldn't tell. He stood holding the photograph for a moment. His chest moved once. A single sharp breath, quickly controlled. She was alive. She was coherent. She'd had enough autonomy to write a message and hold it toward a camera, which meant they hadn't restrained her completely, which was information about how Lent was managing the situation, trying to keep her calm, trying to keep the pregnancy stable, because a dead hostage or a medical emergency changed the leverage calculation entirely, and she'd been trying to warn him. Don't trust who? Holt? Someone else? How much did she know? He passed the photograph to Jin without comment. Jin looked at it and passed it to Rafa. "She's alive," Rafa said. "She's alive," Damian confirmed, "and she's scared enough to write notes and smart enough to use them. Let's go get her." They moved out at 2:19 a.m., 3 men in 2 unremarkable vehicles driving north through a city that had finally, in its deep hours, gone quiet under the rain. Damian drove the gray sedan with Jin beside him, Rafa in the second vehicle running parallel 3 blocks east. Mara's voice came through the earpiece, low, steady, monitoring. The Crane Street corridor at this hour was exactly what it looked like from the satellite imagery. Industrial, lightless, the kind of neighborhood that had no residential population to complain about noise or light pollution or the occasional truck running without plates. The buildings were set back from the road, most of them behind chain link or privacy fencing, a few with guard booths that were unstaffed at this hour. At 2:38 a.m., Damian pulled the sedan off the road onto a gravel access path behind a decommissioned freight depot and killed the lights. Rafa's vehicle was already there, dark and silent. He sat for a moment, His hands were on the steering wheel. He could feel his pulse in his wrists and temples, elevated but controlled, the specific rhythm of a body that had been here before, not exactly here, but in this category of here, and knew how to function in it. Perimeter guard is currently on the south approach, Mara said in his ear. Mobile guard finished a circuit 6 minutes ago. You have approximately 8 minutes before the next pass. Copy, he said quietly. He looked north. Through the fence line and the dark, maybe 200 meters away, a cluster of low buildings sat under the kind of floodlighting that made the shadows around them darker than they would have been without any light at all. One building larger than the others, a loading bay on the north face. Elena was in there. He didn't let himself think past that. He'd learned a long time ago that in situations like this, the mind had to be narrowed deliberately, focused down to the immediate mechanics, because anything wider, the fear, the possibilities, the things that could go wrong in ways you hadn't imagined, would compromise the steadiness that the next 20 minutes required. He got out of the car. He'd taken maybe 4 steps toward the fence when his earpiece crackled. Damian! Mara's voice had changed. Not panicked, Mara didn't panic, but clipped in a way that meant the situation had shifted. I'm picking up outbound communication from inside the compound. It's on one of the frequencies from Vivian's file. Someone inside is making a call right now. He stopped walking. To who? He said. I can't ID the recipient, but the call started 40 seconds ago and it's still active. Jin was beside him now. Rafa a step behind, all 3 of them standing in the dark gravel behind the freight depot, the rain coming down. 8 minutes on the clock before the guard circuit repeated. Someone inside was calling out, which meant they'd been warned, which meant Holt's visit to the office, his look at the photographs on the desk, the 9 minutes in the blue panel van, all of it had moved faster than Damian had accounted for. Lent knew they were coming. How many bodies are showing on thermals? Damian said. I can't confirm thermals from here, Mara said. I don't have that equipment, but if they've been warned, they'll move her, Jin said quietly. It wasn't a question. And there it was. The point the whole night had been building toward, the place where every calculated decision and careful hour of preparation collapsed into a single brutal fact. He didn't have 8 minutes anymore. He might not have 4. If Lent's people were already on a call, already reacting, already moving Elena to a secondary location or doing something worse than moving her, then the careful approach, the shadow corridor, the padlocked loading bay, the 14-minute guard circuit, was already obsolete. He had to go now, loud, fast, and committed, with 3 people, against an unknown number on the other side who'd just been told he was coming. He looked at Rafa. Rafa was already looking at him, already reading the math, already past the part where you weighed it and into the part where you moved. North face, Rafa said. Now. They ran. They hit the fence at a run. Rafa had the cutters, compact, carbon steel, the kind that went through chain link in 2 cuts per link and made almost no sound doing it. He worked fast, hands steady, the rain coming down on his shoulders and the back of his neck, while Damian and Jin held position on either side, watching the perimeter. The floodlights on the south face threw long shadows northward, and the shadow corridor Vivian had identified was real. 8 meters of relative darkness between the older warehouse and the main structure, enough to move through if you moved low and fast and didn't hesitate. 14 seconds to get through the fence. They moved into the shadow corridor in single file. Rafa first, then Jin, then Damian at the rear. The gravel under their feet was wet and dense, the kind that didn't crunch if you distributed your weight properly. Damian distributed his weight properly. He'd been doing this for 20 years in one form or another, and his body remembered it the way bodies remember things that have been repeated under enough pressure, not thought, just execution. The loading bay door was exactly where Vivian's photographs had placed it. Roll-up, metal, padlocked from the outside with a Bricker 700 series, just as she'd said. Rafa crouched in front of it with the bypass tool already in his hand, and Damian watched the corner of the main structure 20 meters away where the mobile guard circuit would eventually bring him. Mara, he said into the earpiece barely above a breath. Status on that call. Ended 90 seconds ago, Mara said. Nothing outbound since, but Damian, I'm picking up vehicle movement on the north access road. Something's coming in, not going out. Reinforcements. Lent had called people in. The padlock gave. Rafa caught it before it could swing and strike the door, lowered it silently to the gravel, and lifted the roll-up door by hand. Slowly, a centimeter at a time, controlling the sound of the mechanism with both palms flat against the metal. It took 11 seconds that felt considerably longer. The gap at the bottom reached knee height, then waist height, then enough. They went in. The interior of the loading bay was dark except for a thin line of light under an interior door at the far end. Artificial, fluorescent, the specific blue-white of industrial lighting. The space smelled like machine oil and cold concrete, and something underneath both of those that Damian's nose identified before his mind did. Food. Recent food. Which meant people had been eating here. Which meant this was an occupied space, not a holding facility hastily converted overnight. They'd been here a while, planning this. Damian moved to the interior door and put his ear against it. Voices. 2, possibly 3, speaking in low tones in a pattern that suggested casual conversation rather than heightened alert. If they'd been warned, the warning hadn't fully propagated to everyone inside, or they were performing calm to cover preparation. Either way, the next 30 seconds would tell him which. He looked at Jin. Jin looked back. A nod. Damian opened the door. The interior corridor was narrow, concrete block walls painted industrial gray, fluorescent strips overhead, 3 doors on the left side and 1 on the right. 2 men stood about 15 feet down the corridor, both turning now, both registering the wrong thing happening, both reaching for what was at their hips. They were fast. Damian and Jin were faster, not because of any particular physical advantage, but because the men in the corridor had expected to have an extra half second, and they didn't. And in the specific arithmetic of these situations, half a second was everything. It was over in 4 seconds. The corridor was quiet again, except for breathing. Damian's, Jin's, Rafa's, as he came through the door behind them. "Which room?" Jin said. Damian moved to the first door on the left. Locked. He moved to the second. Also locked. The third was slightly different. Newer lock, keyed differently from the others, the kind of differentiation that happened when one room was being used for something the others weren't. He tried the handle of the door on the right. It opened. A third man was inside, seated at a folding table, monitoring equipment spread in front of him, headphones half on, the expression of someone who'd heard something and hadn't fully processed it yet. He looked up. He looked at Damian. He started to stand. Rafa stepped past Damian and handled it. The man went down across the folding table. The monitoring equipment scattered. One of the devices, a radio, military grade, the kind you didn't buy at any civilian outlet, hit the floor and continued transmitting, a faint crackle of static and a voice on the other end saying something Damian didn't have time to parse. He picked up the radio and listened. The voice on the other end was giving directions, coordinates, a secondary location. He caught enough to understand that much. And then, underneath the operational language, something else, a name. His own name. Damian Voss. Spoken in a specific context, in a specific sentence that made him stand very still in the middle of the room with the rain coming down on the metal roof and Rafa and Jin both looking at him. The sentence was, "Voss is inside, move the woman now, and make sure Holt understands that once she's moved, there's no deal. The plan goes forward as written." The plan goes forward as written. He'd heard that phrase before. He'd heard it recently. In a different context, in a different conversation, spoken by someone whose voice he knew well. He stood in the monitoring room and turned it over in his mind, and the place it landed was wrong. It landed in the wrong place, on the wrong voice, and for a moment his mind refused to accept the destination. "Damian," Jin said, quiet, alert. "Third door," Damian said. "Now." They got to the third door, and Rafa had the bypass tool out, but the lock was different, heavier, a bolt system with a secondary bar across the outside, the kind of setup you used when you genuinely needed to contain something and weren't worried about accessing it quickly yourself. It took 90 seconds to work through, and every second of it was a specific kind of weight on Damian's chest that he breathed through one count at a time. The door opened. Elena was inside. The room was maybe 4 meters by 4 meters, concrete floor, a folding cot along one wall with blankets piled on it, a space heater in the corner that was doing inadequate work against the cold. Elena was sitting on the cot, not lying, sitting upright, which was her default when she was frightened. She told him that once she couldn't make herself lie down when something was wrong. Her body refused it. She was still wearing the gray coat. Her hair was loose and damp at the edges, and her face, when she turned toward the door, went through 3 expressions in fast succession: shock, relief, and then something more complicated that settled over the relief and didn't leave. Damian crossed the room in 3 steps and went to his knees in front of her. He put his hands on her face. He looked at her. She was pale. She was exhausted. There were the specific marks around her eyes of someone who'd been crying and stopped and been too tired to start again. But she was present. She was looking back at him with the full focus of a woman who was still entirely herself despite everything. "Are you hurt?" he said. His voice came out lower than he intended. "No," she said. "I'm not hurt. The baby's okay. I can feel her moving." She put her hand over his where it rested against her cheek. "I knew you'd come. I knew you'd figure it out. Can you walk?" "Yes. I've been walking." "They let me walk. They weren't—" She stopped. Her expression shifted, that complicated thing that had settled over the relief. "Damian, there's something I need to tell you before we go. There's something I found out." "Tell me on the way out," he said. "No." Her hand tightened over his. "Now, because it changes where we can go." He looked at her. He read her face the way he read every face. The micro-expressions, the body language, the specific quality of the fear underneath the composure. What he read was not panic. It was the face of someone who had spent hours in a cold room processing information she hadn't been able to do anything with, and now that she had the opportunity, she was going to use it regardless of the timing. "Talk," he said. "The man who runs this, Lent. He came to see me tonight, about 3 hours after they brought me here. He wanted me to understand what was happening," he said. "He wanted me to not be afraid." Her jaw tightened at the corners. "He told me this wasn't personal, that it was business, that you'd understand. And then he said something. He said he'd had help setting this up, planning it. He said someone close to you had been working with him for almost 2 years. She paused. "He said it wasn't Prentice Holt." Damian went still. "He said Holt was useful, but he was small," Elena continued. "He said the real help came from someone with actual access to your long-term plans, your financial structure, your exit strategies, someone who knew how you thought, not just what you did day to day." The radio in his jacket pocket was still going. The faint static of it was the only sound in the room for a moment. "Did he give you a name?" Damian said. Elena looked at him. "He didn't have to," she said, "because I'd already heard the name. In the note I wrote, the one I held up for the camera, I tried to write it. But they took the paper before I could finish." "Don't trust," he said. He was hearing his own voice from a distance. "That's where the photograph cut off." "Orrin Drake," she said. He didn't move. He was aware of Jin in the doorway behind him. He was aware of Rafa's breathing just outside the room. He was aware of the radio static, the rain on the roof, the space heater's inadequate hum. He was aware of Elena's hand still holding his, anchoring him to the floor of this cold concrete room. Orrin Drake. 7 years. The man who'd called Holt tonight, not to inform him, to coordinate him. The man whose communication protocols Holt had asked Mara about, because Holt needed to know what Orrin was telling the team so the two of them could calibrate their stories. The man who had helped Damian rebuild the organization after Vivian's betrayal 3 years ago, who had been inside the reconstruction from day one, who had watched Damian build the new walls and quietly, over 7 years, mapped every door. The man who had called Damian tonight at 9 p.m. to report that Elena was missing, that the garage footage showed a black SUV, that the plates read XR. The man who had controlled what Damian knew and when he knew it from the beginning of this night. Damian stood up slowly. He helped Elena to her feet. He kept his hands on her arms until he was sure her balance was steady, and then he stepped back and turned to face Jin, who had heard everything and whose face showed him exactly what he'd been afraid it would show, the specific stillness of a man confirming something he'd hoped wasn't true. Oren called you tonight, Jin said. Yes, Damian said. He called me too, Jin said. Right after you called me. He asked where I was going. I told him I was coming to you. He said he'd meet us there. He didn't come. No. He said he got held up. Jin's voice was level, but his jaw was tight. I thought it was strange. I didn't say anything because you were already moving. Damian thought about the call he'd made from his encrypted phone, the one Vivian had warned him about, the one she'd said would confirm exactly what Lent's people were waiting to confirm. He'd stopped using that phone, but Oren had already been in position by then. Oren had already been feeding the timeline. Every call Damian had made through official channels, every movement of his security detail, every question he'd asked in the hours since Elena disappeared had been filtered through a man who was simultaneously reporting it to a building north of Crane Street. My earpiece, Damian said. He reached up and took it out and looked at it. Standard issue, encrypted, supplied through the organization's technical infrastructure. Supplied through a chain that ran through Oren Drake's oversight. He put it in his pocket without putting it back in his ear. He looked at Rafa. Mara, he said. Rafa understood immediately. He pulled out his burner and called. 3 rings, 4, 5. Mara didn't pick up. Rafa called again, the same result. He looked at Damian, and the look said everything that needed to be said about what that meant, and neither of them put it into words. Damian's chest moved, once, controlled. He looked at the space heater in the corner of the room. He looked at the folding cot. He looked at the blankets Elena had been sitting under for hours in a cold building while he'd been moving through the city with the full confidence of a man who believed he was hunting and had not yet understood he was being herded. We have to move, Jin said. I know, Damian said. He took Elena's arm and they moved out of the room and down the corridor and back through the loading bay and out through the roll-up door into the shadow corridor in the rain. He kept himself between her and the open perimeter. He moved at the pace she could sustain, faster than he'd have chosen, slower than he wanted, calibrated to 36 weeks and a concrete floor and however many hours of sitting in cold fear. They reached the fence. The gap Rafa had cut was still open. They went through. The vehicles were where they'd left them. He got Elena into the back seat of the gray sedan and got in beside her and looked at Rafa, who was in the driver's seat, engine already on. Where? Rafa said. Where? The safe houses he knew were mapped in Oren's intelligence picture. The people he'd planned to call were compromised or unreachable. The encrypted phone was sitting on his office desk like a beacon. He had a burner with 4 numbers in it, 3 of which he'd already used tonight, and the 4th belonged to a woman he'd spent 3 years trying to never need again. He pulled out the single-use phone. He called Vivian. She answered on the first ring. Tell me, she said. It's not Holt, he said. Holt was a distraction. It's Oren Drake. He's had access for 7 years. My communications are compromised. My safe houses are burned, and Mara isn't picking up. A pause. Short, focused. Is Elena with you? Yes. Is she all right? For now. Okay. He heard her moving. I have a location. It's completely off your grid. It's mine. It's not in any document connected to you, and Drake has no reason to know it exists. It's 30 minutes north of the city. Send it to this number. Already done. A beat. Damian, how bad is the exposure? He thought about everything Oren Drake had had access to for 7 years. The financial structure, the territory agreements, the names of people who existed in no official record, the locations of things that couldn't afford to be located, the specific architecture of everything Damian had rebuilt after the last time his organization was taken apart from the inside. Total, he said. The word sat there in the car. Elena's hand found his in the dark of the back seat and held on. He let her. He looked out through the rain-streaked window at the industrial corridor going past as Rafa pulled onto the access road, and he thought about 7 years and what a man could map in 7 years if he was patient and careful and had been trusted absolutely. Vivian's voice came back, quiet and precise. Then we start from 0, tonight. He didn't answer that. He didn't have an answer for it yet. Starting from 0 meant acknowledging that the thing he'd built, The second thing, the reconstruction, the version of the empire he'd raised from the ash of the first betrayal, was gone. Or if not gone, compromised deeply enough that it might as well be. It meant that the 3 years he'd spent telling himself the worst was over had been 3 years of building on ground that was already undermined. It meant Vivian Cross, who had burned it the first time, was now the only person who could help him build it again. He closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. Elena's hand in his. The baby. Their daughter, who didn't have a name yet because Elena had wanted to wait until she could hold her, had said she needed to see her face first, was moving. He could feel it through Elena's hand, through the coat, through the layers of everything that had gone wrong tonight. That small, particular movement. He opened his eyes. His phone buzzed. Vivian's coordinates. "Drive," he said to Rafa. They drove north through the city, through streets that were beginning to thin toward the outer edge where the urban grid gave way to commercial sprawl, and then to the kind of dark open space that existed between cities when there wasn't enough money to develop it yet. The rain was letting up slightly, from heavy to insistent, the kind of rain that was deciding whether it was done. At some point, Elena leaned against him in the back seat. He felt her weight, heavier than it used to be, the specific changed weight of a woman in the last weeks of pregnancy, and he did not move away from it. "I tried to write his name," she said quietly. "On the note. I wrote Orrin and then they took the paper." "I know," he said. "I thought you'd see it in the photograph. I thought you'd know to look at him first." "The photograph was cut off," he said. "I only saw 'don't trust.'" She made a small sound, not quite a laugh. The sound of someone recognizing how close a thing had come to going differently. "She helped me," Elena said after a moment. "The woman who came to see me 2 days ago. She told me to pay attention to everything. She told me if something happened, to write it down, to use whatever I had." Damian turned to look at her. "What woman?" Elena met his eyes. "She said her name was Vivian." The car moved through the rain and the dark. The coordinates on the burner phone showed 18 minutes remaining. Damian looked at the road ahead. He thought about Vivian Cross, who had told Elena to pay attention 2 days ago. 2 days ago, which meant she'd known Elena was a target before she'd called him tonight, which meant she'd gone to Elena first, directly, without coming to him, and had told her to prepare. He thought about what that required. Walking up to the pregnant wife of the man you'd betrayed, the man who had every reason to destroy you if he found you, and warning her. Not because it helped Vivian. It didn't help Vivian. It only helped Elena. He thought about what Vivian had said in the ferry terminal. That Elena had helped her once, without knowing who she was. Just a woman in trouble. And Elena had helped her anyway. He thought about the specific thing it cost a person to walk into that kind of situation and do the right thing when the right thing offered nothing in return. His phone buzzed again. A message from the same number. No text, just a photograph. A building, low, wood-sided, sitting at the edge of tree cover, a light in the window. They were almost there. Rafa turned off the main road onto a gravel track that wound through a quarter-mile of scrub brush and secondary growth trees before opening into a cleared area around the building in the photograph. A single security light above the door. The window light Damian had seen in the image. Vivian's car was already there. She was standing outside in what remained of the rain, waiting. She watched them pull in. Her eyes went immediately to the back seat, to Elena. And the thing that moved across her face then was not the careful, controlled expression she'd worn in the ferry terminal. It was something more exposed than that, the specific expression of a person who has been carrying the weight of a possible outcome and is only now being permitted to set it down. Rafa stopped the car. Damian got out and opened the rear door and helped Elena out, and she stood in the cool, wet air and looked at Vivian for a moment. Then Elena walked over to her and put her arms around her. Vivian stood very still for a second, like she hadn't expected to be allowed to be touched. Then her hands came up and she held on. Damian watched them. He stood in the gravel in the diminishing rain, and he watched the woman who had ruined him hold the woman he loved, and he felt something inside him that had been wound tight for 15 years, for longer than Elena, longer than the organization, longer than all of it, crack slightly along a seam he hadn't known was there. He breathed through it. Then he walked toward the building because there was still work to do and the night was not over. And Orrin Drake was still out there with 7 years of his life in his hands, and Carver Lent was still breathing, and what came next was going to require him to be a different kind of man than the one he'd been building himself into since he was 23 years old. He stopped at the door. He turned back. Vivian was guiding Elena toward the building now, one hand at her elbow, careful and steady. Jen was behind them. Rafa was on the phone, already working. He looked at Vivian over Elena's head. She looked back at him. "You went to her first," he said. Vivian met his gaze. "Yes." 2 days ago. "Yes." "You knew she was a target, and you went to her directly instead of coming to me." "I went to her," Vivian said, "because she was the one in danger, and I knew she'd listen. I wasn't sure about you." He looked at her for a long moment. The rain came down between them, lighter now, almost finished. "You were right," he said finally, "not to be sure." He went inside. The building was a single large room converted into something livable. A table, chairs, a propane heater already going, a cot against one wall. Basic, functional. The kind of place that didn't exist in any record because it had never needed to. He sat down at the table. He put the burner phone on the surface. He put the photographs and the drive beside it. He put his hands flat on the table and looked at them. 7 years of Orrin Drake. 3 years of believing the organization was sealed. A lifetime of building walls and calling them safety. And underneath all of it, underneath every strategic decision and territorial expansion and careful arrangement of loyalty and leverage, the same fundamental error, repeated. The belief that control was the same thing as security. That if you held enough, saw enough, managed enough, the thing you were most afraid of losing couldn't reach you. Elena came and sat across the table from him. She didn't say anything. She looked at his face and let him be looked at, which was the specific kind of intimacy he'd spent years deflecting and had stopped deflecting sometime in the last 18 months without entirely noticing when. "What happens now?" she said finally. He looked at her. He thought about Orrin Drake, who had his financial architecture, about Carver Lent, who was still operational, about Prentice Holt, who was walking back into Damian's building right now with a file box and a composed face, about Mara, who wasn't answering her phone and whose silence had too many possible explanations, none of them good. He thought about Vivian, standing in the doorway of the room, and the 3 years between them and what it was going to cost to work with her and what it was going to cost more not to. He thought about his daughter, who didn't have a name yet. "We take it apart," he said, "all of it. Everything Orrin has access to. Every account, every location, every agreement. We move or we burn it. Tonight. We start from zero." Elena held his gaze. "And then?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Then we build something he can't get into." Vivian spoke from the doorway. Her voice was quiet and direct. "There's one more thing you need to know. Something I didn't tell you at the terminal because I wasn't sure it was relevant yet." Damian looked at her. "The federal task force that's been building a case on the Lent family for 3 years, she said. "They're closer than Lent knows. I've been in contact with them." The room went very still. "For how long?" Damian said. Vivian held his gaze without flinching. 8 months, she said. The room held the silence for 3 full seconds. Then Damian said, 8 months. "Yes," Vivian said. "You've been feeding information to a federal task force for 8 months. He said it the way you repeat something back when your mind needs the extra pass to confirm it's real. While you were building surveillance on Lent, while you were watching his people watch my building, while you were sitting on everything you knew. Yes. And you didn't tell me tonight at the terminal because I needed to know how you'd react," Vivian said. "And I needed to know if Elena was safe first, in that order." Jin was standing by the wall with his arms crossed and his face doing something complicated. Rafa had stopped his phone call and was listening without turning around. Elena sat across the table from Damian and didn't speak, but her hand was still on the table between them, and Damian was aware of it the way you're aware of the only stable surface in a tilting room. "Who's running the task force?" he said. a federal agent named Solis, Carla Solis. She's been building the Lent file since his supposed death. She never believed the accident. She kept the case open. When I came back to the city 8 months ago, I reached out to her. You came back 8 months ago? Yes. And you've been here for 8 months? Yes. He absorbed that. 8 months in the same city. 8 months of existing in the same urban grid, breathing the same air, moving through the same streets. He'd spent 3 years telling himself she was gone, and she'd been here for 8 months, and he hadn't known, which told him 2 things. That she was good at not being found when she didn't want to be, and that his intelligence picture of his own city was considerably less complete than he'd believed. Does Solis know about me? He said. Vivian's expression shifted by a fraction. She knows I have a source inside Voss's organization. She doesn't know the source is me, and she doesn't know I have direct contact with you. But she knows the organization exists. Damian, everyone knows the organization exists. That was true, and he didn't argue it. What does she have on Lent? Financial records. 15 months of documented transactions through shell companies she's traced 4 layers deep. Communication intercepts. Partial, not complete, but enough. 2 witnesses who agreed to testify before Lent knew they'd flipped. She paused. And now she has the location of his primary operating facility, because I sent it to her 2 hours ago. The room went very quiet again. You sent her the compound, Damian said. Yes, while you were driving there. He thought about this. He thought about federal vehicles rolling toward the Crane Street corridor, about the timeline, about where Lent's people were right now and where Orrin Drake was, and what Prentice Holt was doing in his building with a file box and a composed face. She's moving on it tonight, he said. It wasn't a question. She was supposed to wait for my confirmation that Elena was clear, Vivian said. I sent the confirmation when you told me you had her. They're moving now. Damian stood up from the table. He walked to the window and looked out at the gravel clearing, the tree line, the sky that was starting to show the first marginal graying of a night moving toward 4 a.m. His reflection was faint in the glass, dark jacket, jaw set, the specific look of a man recalibrating at speed. Orrin Drake didn't know the compound was being raided. If Drake was in contact with Lent, and he was, 7 years of evidence pointed to nothing else, then Drake would know Damian had gotten Elena out, and would know the timeline had broken down. He'd be making decisions right now about what to preserve and what to abandon. He'd be thinking about exits. If Drake got out before the federal net closed, everything he was carrying, 7 years of Damian's financial architecture, names, locations, structures, walked out with him into a world where it could be sold to someone else, or used as leverage in a cooperation deal with the same federal task force Vivian had just sent toward the compound. Drake, Damian said. I know, Vivian said behind him. He turned. Does Solis have him? Not yet. He's not at the compound. I told her about him tonight when I gave her the location. She's looking. He'll go to the building, Damian said. He'll go back to my building. He has things there. Access terminals, physical records, and the security infrastructure. He'll want to wipe what he can before he runs. He was already picking up the burner phone. How long since you sent Solis the confirmation? 20 minutes. 20 minutes. The compound was 30 minutes from the building, maybe 25 the way federal vehicles moved. Drake would have heard from Lent's people the moment things went wrong at the compound, which was, he checked the time, approximately 40 minutes ago. Drake had a 40-minute head start and a clear destination. He called Theo Cassell. Theo picked up immediately, which suggested he hadn't slept, which was characteristic. Your man left the parking structure on Breck 45 minutes ago, Theo said before Damian could speak. He went back to your building. I have eyes on the lobby entrance now. He's still inside. Don't let him leave, Damian said. Whatever it takes. Do not let him leave that building. That's going to require me to be more visible than I prefer, Theo said. I know. Name your price later. He hung up and looked at Rafa. I need to be at the building in 20 minutes. Rafa was already moving toward the door. Damian, Elena's voice from the table. He turned. She was looking at him with the specific expression she used when she was going to say something he wasn't going to want to hear but needed to. You can't go back there. I know the risks. That's not what I mean. She held his gaze steadily. If Solis is moving on the compound and she has Drake's name, going back to your building puts you inside a federal operations perimeter. Whatever happens there tonight is going to be documented. You need to not be in that documentation. He looked at her. She was right. She was often right about the things he didn't want to hear, which was one of the reasons he'd stopped deflecting when she looked at him. Jin, he said. Jin was already reading the thought. I'll go. Theo's on site, Damian said. He'll hold Drake as long as he can. I need you to get there before that hold breaks. I need Drake intact. Not because I want him intact, but because what he knows is worth more than what I can do to him tonight. Jin nodded. He looked at Rafa. Something passed between them. The wordless communication of men who'd been in bad situations together enough times that they'd developed a shared language for the ones ahead. Then Jin was out the door and the sound of the second vehicle leaving faded into the dark. Rafa stayed. He positioned himself near the door of the building and went quiet in the way he went quiet when he was on, which was a different kind of quiet from his regular silence. More alert. The stillness of something coiled. Damian came back to the table and sat down. Elena was watching him. Vivian was still in the doorway. Solis, he said to Vivian, when this is over, what does she want? Vivian came into the room fully and sat at the end of the table, equidistant from both of them, which seemed deliberate, as if she was aware of the geometry and its implications. She wants Lent's full network, every distribution chain, every financial node, every name he's operating under. She doesn't have all of that. Her case is strong, but it has gaps. I've been filling gaps for 8 months. And in exchange, my slate, Vivian said, whatever I did 3 years ago, and she knows what I did. I told her everything. She's agreed to close the file if I deliver Lent completely. Damian looked at her. You told her everything? Yes. Including your role in what happened to my brother? Yes. She held his gaze without flinching. Including that. He thought about Marcus, who was in a federal facility serving year 3 of 20, who'd called Damian 6 months after sentencing and told him not to come visit because he couldn't look at him yet and didn't know when he could. Who Damian had been carrying like a stone in his chest since the day the verdict was read. The specific weight of someone else's consequence paid for something that had been aimed at you. He thought about what it would mean if Vivian's cooperation agreement with Solis could be structured to include Marcus's case. Whether the information she'd been delivering was worth the kind of pull that moved a sentence. He hadn't asked that yet. He wasn't sure he was ready to ask it and hear the answer. Is Solis reachable right now? He said. She gave me a direct line, Vivian said. For tonight. Call her, Damian said. Tell her Drake is in my building. Tell her Theo Castle is holding him, and give her Theo's description so her people don't make the wrong call when they arrive. And tell her... He stopped. He chose the next words carefully because they were the kind of words that, once said, restructured everything. Tell her I want a conversation, after tonight. A formal conversation, with appropriate legal representation about what cooperation from my end could look like. The room was very quiet. Elena looked at him. Her expression was not surprise, Abbas. She'd known him long enough to recognize when he'd already decided something and was saying it out loud for the first time. What he saw in her face was something closer to relief, with a grief running underneath it for the version of their life that would close when this door opened. Vivian said nothing for a moment, then, You understand what that means. I understand exactly what it means, Damian said. Make the call. She made the call. She walked to the far side of the room to do it, her voice low and clipped, and Damian sat at the table and looked at his hands, and then at Elena, and then at the propane heater's orange glow in the corner. The call lasted 4 minutes. When Vivian came back, her face told him before her words did. Solis's team is at the compound, she said. They found Lent on site. He's in custody. A pause. Drake is still in your building. Jin is en route. Solis is routing 2 agents there. And the conversation. She said yes, Vivian said. She said she'll meet you wherever you specify, whenever you're ready, and she said to tell you, a slight hesitation. She said to tell you she knows about your brother and that she's open to discussing the full scope of what cooperation might address. Something moved through Damian's chest. He didn't let it reach his face. He held it there, in the interior, and breathed around it. His phone, the burner, buzzed. Jin. "I'm at the building," Jin said. "Theo's in the lobby. Drake is on the security floor. He's been there for 20 minutes. I don't think he knows we're outside yet. Can you get to him before he moves? Theo says he's been pulling physical drives from the security terminal. If he's almost done, he might already be heading down." "Then go now," Damian said. "Jin, I need him standing. Whatever else happens, I need him standing and talking." "Understood." A beat. "There's something else. Mara's here." Damian's grip on the phone tightened by a fraction. "Is she all right?" "She's all right. She said Drake locked her in the secondary communication room 2 hours ago. She's been working at the door since then. She got out about 15 minutes before I arrived." A pause. "She's angry." "Good," Damian said. "Tell her to stay in the lobby until Solus's people arrive. Tell her not to touch Drake." "She's not going to like that." "I know. Tell her anyway." He ended the call. The next 40 minutes were the specific kind of waiting that had no productive outlet. He'd deployed everything he could deploy. The pieces were moving. The only thing he could do now was sit in a building north of the city with his pregnant wife and the woman who'd once destroyed him and wait for the night to resolve itself into something he could act on. He got up and poured water from the kitchen, so basic, utilitarian, the kind of setup Vivian had apparently maintained for exactly this kind of contingency, and brought a glass to Elena. She drank it. She looked at him. "Sit down," she said. He sat. They sat across from each other at the table in the small building in the trees, and the rain came down one last time and stopped. Outside, through the window, the sky over the tree line was beginning its first slow concession toward morning. Not light yet, but the suggestion of light coming, the darkness losing its absolute quality. "She saved my life," Elena said. She said it quietly, not dramatically, the tone of someone reporting a fact. "Vivian, when she came to me 2 days ago, she told me to trust no one I hadn't personally known for years. She told me if I was moved, to go cooperatively and not fight, because fighting would make the situation unpredictable. She told me what to do if I got access to a camera." She paused. "I didn't know who she was when she helped me the first time. When she came back 2 days ago and told me, I almost didn't believe her." Damian looked across the table. Vivian was at the window, looking out, giving them the room in the way you give people room when you know you're the complicated element in the space. "Why didn't you tell me she'd been there?" he said. Elena's jaw shifted slightly. "Because I wasn't sure how you'd react, and I needed you focused." She held his gaze. "The same reason she wasn't sure how you'd react. Apparently that's something people who know you have in common." He sat with that. "She told me what she did," Elena said. 3 years ago. What her role was. She told me all of it." "And," he said, "and she came back and warned me anyway, knowing what you might do if you found out she was here." Elena looked at him steadily. "That's not nothing, Damian." "No," he said, "it's not nothing." The burner buzzed again. "Jin." He picked up immediately. "We have him," Jin said. He was breathing harder than usual. Exertion, recent, not quite settled. "Drake tried to go out the back when he heard Theo in the lobby. I was at the back. He didn't get far." A pause that held something in it Damian couldn't fully read. "He wants to talk." "I'm sure he does," Damian said. "He says he has something he didn't give Lent. He says he kept it back as insurance, and he'll give it to you directly if you come." Another pause. "He's asking for you specifically. Won't talk to anyone else." Damian looked at the table surface. He thought about Oren Drake. 7 years of loyalty that turned out to be 7 years of something else, sitting in the back of his own building with Jin and Theo on either side of him, and federal agents incoming. He thought about what a man in that position would keep back, what he would protect, what he would understand to be his last viable leverage. "Tell him I'm coming," Damian said. "Damian, tell him." He ended the call. Elena was looking at him. "You said you wouldn't go back there." I said I couldn't be in the documentation, he said. Solis's people aren't there yet. There's a window. How long? He checked the time, estimated the federal response from the compound, rerouted to his building. 30 minutes, possibly less. Then you have 20, Elena said. She held his gaze. Don't push past 20. He stood up. He looked at her for a moment. The gray coat, the dark circles, the composed and steady face of a woman who had spent the night in a concrete room and was still, somehow, the most oriented person in whatever room she was in. He reached across the table and put his hand against her jaw the way he had in that room an hour ago, and she leaned into it slightly, just slightly, and that small pressure against his palm was something he was going to carry for a long time. 20 minutes, he said. He looked at Vivian. Stay with her. Vivian met his gaze. Yes, she said. He went out to the car. Rafa was already in the driver's seat. They drove back into the city in the last of the dark, the streets wet and emptied out, the city's overnight hours moving toward their natural conclusion. 20 minutes on the highway. Damian sat in the passenger seat and didn't speak, and Rafa didn't ask him to. And the silence was the working kind, the kind where both men were running calculations too complex to interrupt. They went in through the east entrance. The lobby, when Damian entered it, was dim and tense. Theo Cassell standing near the elevator bank. Mara sitting in one of the lobby chairs with the rigid posture of someone obeying an instruction they disagreed with. Two of Jin's contacts positioned near the main doors. Mara looked at Damian when he came in, and the look on her face was a complicated combination of relief and fury and exhaustion that she'd clearly been maintaining at significant personal cost for the last 2 hours. Security floor, she said. Jin's with him. I know. Are you all right? I'm fine, she said. I'm furious. Good. Stay here. She pressed her mouth into a line and stayed. He took the elevator to the security floor. The doors opened onto a corridor that was familiar in the bones but felt different tonight. Its own space, its own history, the specific texture of a place where things had happened that he now had to recontextualize against 7 years of a different reality. Oren Drake had walked this corridor every day for 7 years. He'd helped design the security infrastructure on this floor. He knew where every camera was, every blind spot, every routing path for the communication systems, because he had built those systems. Jin was at the end of the corridor outside the main security room, arms crossed, steady as ever. He looked at Damian when he came down the hall and gave him a small nod that communicated, intact, contained, ready. Damian opened the door. Oren Drake was sitting in the chair in front of the main security terminal. Not restrained, because he'd apparently decided to stop running and start calculating, which was the move of a man who understood his options had narrowed to the point where calculation was the only remaining tool. He was 51 years old, broad through the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had always read as reliable, solid, unhurried, the face of someone you gave things to because he looked like he'd take care of them. He looked up when Damian came in. His expression was the one Damian had least expected. Not fear, not defiance, not the manufactured composure of a cornered man performing control. It was something closer to exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been holding something up for a very long time and has finally set it down. Sit down, Damian, he said. I'll stand. Drake looked at him for a moment, then he nodded, accepting the geometry of it. Fair. What did you keep back? Damian said. A record, Drake said. 18 months of Lent's full financial network. Not the surface layers, the core. Every account, every intermediary, every beneficial owner. Solis has fragments. I have the complete structure. And you're offering it to me. I'm offering it to you to give to Solis, Drake said. As part of whatever conversation you're going to have with her. Because I know you're going to have that conversation. I've known for 3 months that was where this was heading, and I know you're smart enough to see it's the right move. He paused. I want to be part of the arrangement. I want to be the one who delivers the financial network. Damian looked at him. 7 years, he said. Drake held his gaze. Yes. Why? The word landed the same way it had landed with Vivian in the ferry terminal. Clean, simple, with everything behind it. Drake was quiet for a moment, then, Lent had something on me. From before I came to work for you. Something I'd done that I couldn't afford to have surfaced. He looked at his hands. He found me about a year after I started working for you. He said he'd bury it if I cooperated. He said it would be simple. It was never simple, Damian said. No, Drake said. It was never simple. The room held that for a moment. Damian looked at the man who'd sat across from him at tables for 7 years, who'd been in rooms where plans were made, who'd held the security of everyone Damian trusted in his hands and had been simultaneously holding something else. He thought about what it must feel like to live inside that for 7 years. He wasn't going to say he understood it. He wasn't going to say it changed the accounting. But he could recognize it as a human thing, the way catastrophic choices were always, underneath the strategy and the calculation, human things. The record, Damian said. Where is it? Drake reached into his jacket, slow, visible, telegraphed, the same careful motion Vivian had used in the ferry terminal, and produced a drive. He set it on the console between them. Damian looked at it. He looked at Drake. He picked up the drive. His phone buzzed. Rafa, from the lobby. One word. Solis. Damian looked at the drive in his hand. He looked at Orrin Drake, who looked back at him with the exhausted face of a man who had run out of versions of himself to deploy and was sitting now with whatever was left underneath. You're going to tell her everything, Damian said. Not the version you've edited, everything, including what you gave them about my brother's case. Drake's jaw moved. That might extend my exposure. Yes, Damian said, it will. Drake looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the floor. Then he nodded. Damian walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at the room. The security terminal, the screens showing the lobby below where Solis's people were arriving, the drives stacked on the console, 7 years of his life mapped and cataloged and sitting in this room like an archive of a version of himself he was about to close. For what it's worth, Drake said behind him, I never wanted it to go this far. Damian stood in the doorway. It went exactly as far as the choices made it go, he said. He walked out into the corridor where Jin was waiting, and behind him the door swung shut on Orrin Drake and 7 years and the last version of an empire that had been built on the assumption that control was the same thing as safety. And as Damian walked toward the elevator with the drive in his hand and federal agents coming up from the lobby below and the first gray light of morning beginning outside the building's high windows, he understood, with the specific clarity that only comes when everything has already broken, that he had never been safe, not once, not for a single day, and that the life he was walking toward now would be built on something different, something he didn't have a word for yet but could feel taking shape in the space where the old architecture used to be. The elevator arrived. He stepped in. The doors closed. The elevator opened onto the lobby at 4:47 a.m. Carla Solis was not what Damian had expected, which was probably intentional on her part. She was mid-40s, compact, wearing a rain jacket over plain clothes rather than the federal gear her 2 agents flanking the lobby entrance were wearing. Her hair was pulled back and her eyes were the kind of dark that missed very little. She looked at Damian when the elevator opened and she didn't move toward him and she didn't move away. She held her ground and let him come to her, which told him something about how she'd run the conversation she'd been building toward for 18 months. Mara was still in the lobby chair. Theo Castle had positioned himself near the door with the careful neutrality of a man who was technically present and would prefer not to be documented. Rafa stood by the east corridor entrance with his arms at his sides. Damian walked across the lobby and stopped 3 feet from Solis. She looked at him. He looked at her. Mr. Voss, she said. Agent Solis. My people have Lent in custody at the compound. Your building is currently not part of any active warrant. She said that clearly, deliberately, the way you say something you want a person to hear without ambient noise around it. Anything that happens in this lobby in the next few minutes is a conversation between private individuals. I understand the distinction, Damian said. I was told you want to talk. Eventually, he said, with counsel, on my timeline and with appropriate preparation. That's reasonable, she said. Tonight is not that conversation. No, he said. Tonight I have something for you. He held out the drive. Drake's drive. The complete financial network. 18 months of Lent's core structure that Solis's case had been built around the outside of without ever reaching the center. She looked at it. She looked at him. Where did this come from? She said. The man upstairs will tell you. Damian said. He'll tell you everything. He's made a decision about how he wants to handle what comes next, and delivering that to you directly is part of it. He paused. I'd suggest hearing him out before you make any charging decisions. The information he has is worth more than the charges, and you're smart enough to know that. Solis looked at the drive in his hand for a moment longer. Then she reached out and took it. The conversation, she said. When you're ready, you have my number through Ms. Cross. Yes, he said. She held his gaze for one more second, measuring something, filing it, the specific look of a person who has been building a case and is now seeing one of its central figures in person for the first time and recalibrating the picture against the reality. Then she turned and signaled her agents, and they moved toward the elevator. Damian stood in the lobby and watched them go. Mara appeared at his elbow. She didn't say anything immediately. She stood beside him and they both watched the elevator doors close on Solis and her people. Drake? She said finally. He'll cooperate, Damian said. And Holt. Holt is a smaller problem. He'll understand which way the situation is moved, and he'll make the rational decision. He paused. If he doesn't, Solis has enough to pick him up by morning regardless. Mara was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, what does cooperation with Solis look like for us? Damian looked at the closed elevator doors. I don't know yet, he said. I know what I want it to look like. Whether that's achievable is a conversation that hasn't happened yet. But you're going to have it. Yes. She absorbed that. He watched her absorb it, the small adjustments in her posture, the way she was running the implications forward, the specific quality of her silence as she processed what it meant for the shape of everything they'd all been doing for the last 15 years. Okay, she said finally. Just that. Okay. The word of someone choosing to trust a direction they couldn't fully see yet because the alternative was worse, and because the trust had been earned across enough time that it could survive a moment of incomplete information. He looked at her. I'm sorry about the room, he said. 2 hours locked in. Don't, she said. Not unkindly. Just don't. He didn't. He told Rafa to drive. They went back north through a city that was beginning its first slow movements toward morning. Delivery trucks, early shift workers, the specific thin light of 5 a.m. that made everything look provisional and raw. The rain was completely finished. The streets were wet and reflective, and the city's lights doubled themselves in the standing water on the asphalt, blurring and shifting every time a vehicle passed. When they reached the building north of the tree line, the light in the window was still on. He went inside. Elena was asleep on the cot against the wall, the blankets pulled up to her chin, her face in sleep carrying an exhaustion that the waking version of her was too disciplined to show. Vivian was at the table with a cup of something hot, not quite looking at him when he came in, giving him the first moment to see Elena without an audience. He stood at the edge of the room and looked at his wife sleeping. He stayed that way for a while. Then he sat down across from Vivian at the table, quietly enough that he didn't disturb Elena, and she poured a second cup and pushed it toward him, and he took it. Solis has the drive, he said. Vivian nodded. Drake's cooperating. He'll give her everything. He wrapped his hands around the cup. The heat was immediate and concrete. Lent's in custody. I know, she said. She sent me a message. He looked at his hands around the cup. The conversation with Solis, he said. About my brother. What she said. That she's open to discussing the full scope. What does that actually mean? From where you sit, having worked with her for 8 months. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Not the hesitant kind of quiet, the honest kind, the kind that was measuring what she could actually say rather than what would be easier to hear. She's a practical woman, Vivian said. She's been after Lent for 3 years, and the gaps in her case have been real gaps, not procedural, evidentiary. What Drake just gave her fills those gaps. What you might give her in a cooperation agreement would fill the rest of the picture she's been trying to build. She paused. Marcus's case was built on testimony and documentation that originated with Lent's organization. If that's now demonstrably compromised, and with Drake's full record it is, then the case against your brother has a structural problem that any competent appeal would identify. Damian held the cup. It's not guaranteed, Vivian said. I want to be clear about that. I'm not telling you it's guaranteed. I know, he said. But it's real, she said. It's a real possibility, not a favor. A legal reality that follows from the evidence. He set the cup down. He looked at the table surface. He thought about Marcus, who was in year 3 of 20, who hadn't let Damian visit, who had told him on the phone 6 months after sentencing that he needed Damian to live his life because watching Damian carry this was harder than the sentence itself. He thought about what it would mean to call Marcus and say, not that the worst was over. He'd said that before, after the reconstruction, and it hadn't been true, but that there was a specific legal mechanism in motion, a real thing, something that could be pointed to and examined. He thought about how long he'd been waiting to have something real to say. Vivian, he said. She looked at him. What you did 3 years ago, he said. He said it the way you say something when you've rehearsed it so many times in your head that saying it out loud feels both necessary and slightly absurd. The specific thing you did, the testimony, the documentation you provided. You understood what it would do to my brother's case. Her jaw tightened. Yes. Did you know about Marcus specifically before you did it? A pause. I knew the testimony would implicate people in your organization. I knew the documentation created exposure for the people who ran operations connected to Lent's distribution. She held his gaze. I told myself I didn't know Marcus specifically would be caught in it. That's true, technically, but I knew the blast radius was wide and I made the choice anyway. She stopped. Then, I've thought about whether those two things are meaningfully different for a long time. I haven't found a satisfying answer. They're not meaningfully different, he said. No, she said. They're not. He looked at her. She looked back. The space between them was full of everything that had happened and everything that hadn't, and neither of them moved to close it or push it further away. And after a moment, he reached across the table and picked up his cup again and drank. You went to Elena, he said. Yes. 2 days ago. You walked up to my pregnant wife and warned her, knowing what I'd do if I found out you were in the city. I calculated the risk, Vivian said. I decided it was acceptable. That's not why you did it. She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the table. Then she said quietly, No, it's not why I did it. You did it because you owe her, he said, and because you're still the person who does the right thing when the cost is high enough that it actually counts for something. You always were. He paused. That's why what happened 3 years ago cost me as much as it did. Not just the damage, the fact that you were capable of it. Vivian was quiet. Her hands around her cup were still. I'm not going to tell you it's forgiven, he said. I don't know if that's the right word for what I actually feel about it. But I'm telling you that I understand what you've done over the last 8 months and why, and that what Marcus gets out of this, whatever it is, I know it's connected to you. She looked up. Her eyes were steady, but the steadiness was the earned kind, not the natural kind, and he could see the difference. That's enough, she said quietly. I know, he said. They sat in the kitchen of the small building in the trees while the night finished its business outside, the dark thinning to gray to the first diluted suggestion of actual morning light, and the propane heater ticked in the corner and Elena breathed in her sleep across the room, and neither of them said anything else for a while. And it was the most honest silence Damian Voss had sat in for longer than he could clearly remember. He went to the cot at some point. He didn't entirely plan it. His body simply arrived there, and sat on the edge of it near Elena's feet. He didn't lie down. He didn't sleep. He sat and watched the window change color as morning came in, and he thought about the building they'd just left, and the drive he'd handed to Solis, and the conversation he was going to have with a lawyer this week, and with Solis the week after, and with Marcus whenever Marcus would let him come. He thought about the thing he'd said to Rafa. We start from zero. Starting from zero was not the same as starting from nothing. He understood that differently now than he had at 2 a.m. when he'd said it. Zero wasn't the bottom. It was the place you reached when you'd stripped away everything that couldn't be trusted, everything that had been built on the wrong material, and were standing on clean ground for the first time in long enough that you'd forgotten what it felt like. It felt like this. Like sitting in a small building in the trees with a cup of cooling tea and the woman he loved asleep 3 feet away, and a sky going from black to gray to the specific pale gold that happened in the first real minutes of a new day. Elena woke a little after 6. She didn't startle. She surfaced slowly, the way she'd always surfaced from deep sleep, like something rising through water. She opened her eyes, and they found him immediately, which was the specific thing she did. She always found him first when she woke, and he'd never asked her about it because some things were better held than examined. "You're back," she said. "I'm back," he said. She sat up slowly, both hands on the cot for balance, and he stood and put a hand at her elbow, and she let him. She looked around the room. Vivian asleep in the chair at the table now, her head against the wall, the gray morning outside the window. "Tell me," Elena said. He told her. The condensed version, the facts without the internal weather. Solus, Drake, the drive, the charges moving forward against Lent, the conversation still ahead. He told her about Marcus and what Vivian had said about the evidentiary structure of his case, and when he said that he watched Elena's face do something that she didn't have full control of, a sudden brightness in her eyes that she didn't try to hide. "When can you call him?" she said. "This week," Damian said. "When I have something solid to tell him instead of a possibility. I don't want to call him with a possibility." Elena looked at him. "Call him with the possibility," she said. "Let him have it. Don't carry it by yourself until it becomes certainty. He'd want to carry it with you." He held her gaze. She was right, as she tended to be about the things that required him to let his grip on something loosen. He nodded. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He put his arm around her carefully, aware of all the weight and the child and the long night she'd been through. And she was warm and solid and present in the way she'd been present for the last 4 years of his life. Steadily, without demanding that he become someone he wasn't yet. With the particular patience of a woman who saw who he was actually moving toward and was willing to wait for the distance to close. They stayed that way while the morning came in fully. Vivian drove back to the city alone that morning. Before she left, she stood in the gravel outside the building, and Elena came out and they talked for a few minutes in low voices, and Damian watched from the doorway without trying to hear what was said. At one point, Elena put her hand against Vivian's arm and said something, and Vivian nodded, and then Elena came back inside and Vivian got in her car. She stopped before she closed the driver's door. She looked at Damian across the roof of the car. "I'll send you Solus's personal contact," she said. "For the formal conversation, use your lawyer's line, not a burner." "I know how to make a call," he said. Something that might have been in a different life. A faint smile moved across her face. "Yeah," she said. "You do." She closed the door. She drove down the gravel track through the trees and disappeared onto the main road. Damian stood in the doorway of the building for a moment after she left. The morning was cool and clear, the wet gravel catching the light in a way that made everything look more specific than it usually did. Each stone distinct, each puddle its own small mirror. The trees at the edge of the clearing dripped their last water from the night's rain. He breathed in, he breathed out. He went back inside. 6 weeks later, Elena went into labor on a Wednesday afternoon. It was not dramatic in the way he'd anticipated. Not a sudden emergency, not a race through the city. It was slow and then fast and then over in the way he'd been told it would be by people he hadn't believed because it seemed too simple. And he was there for all of it, standing where she told him to stand, doing what she told him to do. And at 11:14 p.m., a girl came into the world in a hospital room on the east side of the city, and the nurse put her in his hands. She was very small. She had dark hair, which surprised him for a reason he couldn't explain. He'd known it was possible. Elena had dark hair, he had dark hair, but the actual reality of it, the specific darkness of this specific child's hair, was different from the abstraction. She was looking at him. Not with recognition. He wasn't naive enough to assign recognition to a newborn, but with the particular undirected alertness of a new thing that had not yet learned where to look and was looking everywhere. He held her, and his hands were steady in the way they'd trained themselves to be. And then, after a moment, they weren't. Not much. Not visibly, he thought. But Elena saw it because Elena always saw the things that didn't make it to his surface, and she reached up from where she was lying and put her hand on his arm, and he stood in that hospital room and held his daughter and felt the thing that had cracked slightly along the seam in the small building in the trees open a little further, not breaking, just expanding, creating space for something that hadn't fit before. They named her Claire. Elena had been carrying the name for months but had waited, as she'd said she would, until she saw her. He'd asked once what the name meant to her. Elena had said, clear, like after rain, when everything's been washed and the air is different. He thought about that now. Standing by the hospital window while Elena slept and Claire slept in the plastic hospital bassinet, and the city outside was doing whatever the city did at midnight on a Wednesday, its million lives moving through their million private weathers, all of them indifferent to the specific fact that a man who had spent 20 years building walls was standing at a window understanding for the first time what the walls had cost him. He called Marcus the next morning. He stood in the hospital hallway with a paper coffee cup going cold in his hand, and he called his brother's facility and worked through the 3 intermediary steps it took to reach an actual line, and Marcus picked up on the 4th ring with the specific wariness of a man who'd learned not to expect good news. "Damian," Marcus said. "Hey," Damian said. A pause. "You sound different." "I had a daughter last night," Damian said. 11:14 p.m. Dark hair. She's small." The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. When Marcus spoke again, something in his voice was different. Not soft, exactly. Marcus had never been soft, but shifted. The way a room shifted when a window was opened in it. "Yeah," Marcus said. Not a word with content. A word that was holding something. "I also have something to tell you," Damian said. "About your case, about what's been happening." He took a breath. "I want to tell you everything. I want you to hear all of it. And I want you to know that some of what I have to tell you is a possibility, not a certainty. I know that. But it's a real possibility, Marcus. Something specific and legal and in motion." Another pause. "How long have you known?" 6 weeks, Damian said. "I was waiting until I had something solid." "Don't do that," Marcus said. "Don't carry things by yourself until they're solid. I've been in here for 3 years and you've been carrying all of it out there alone, and neither of us—" He stopped. "Tell me. Start at the beginning and tell me." So Damian told him. He stood in the hospital hallway with the cold coffee and the pale morning light coming through the corridor windows, and he told his brother everything. And for the first time in 3 years, he heard Marcus's breathing change, heard it loosen, heard the specific quality of someone whose chest had been constricted, receiving the first real indication that the pressure might eventually lift. He didn't promise. He was careful not to promise what he couldn't guarantee, but he told Marcus the truth, which was that the evidentiary foundation of his conviction had a structural problem, and that there was a federal agent who understood that problem, and that the documentation to support an appeal was now assembled and in the hands of a lawyer who knew what to do with it. "Vivian Cross," Marcus said at the end of it. "Yes," Damian said. "She went to Solace." "Yes." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what to do with that," he said. "Neither do I," Damian said. "I'm letting it sit." "Yeah," Marcus said. "Yeah, okay." A pause. "Damian?" "Yeah?" "Can I see the baby? If there's a visit, when Elena's ready." Something in Damian's chest moved in a way he didn't try to manage. "Yeah, Marcus, as soon as we can arrange it." The formal conversation with Solace happened 3 weeks later, in a conference room with 2 lawyers on each side and a recorder on the table, and the specific stiff formality of proceedings that understood their own weight. It lasted 4 hours. Damian said what he'd agreed to say, provided what he'd agreed to provide. A specific, bounded set of information about the financial architecture of operations he was simultaneously and formally exiting. It was not comfortable. It was not designed to be comfortable. It was designed to be accurate, and it was. At the end of the 4 hours, Solis looked across the table at him and said, "I've reviewed the Marcus Voss case file in light of the Drake documentation. I've shared my findings with the relevant prosecutor's office. I'm not making you a promise. That's not my role. But I'm telling you that what I found is significant." He looked at her. "Thank you," he said. He said it simply, without the edge he might have brought to it 6 months ago, because some things deserve to be received the way they were given. Prentice Holt cooperated with Solis's investigation and received a reduced charge arrangement that took him out of Damian's world permanently and deposited him in a quieter life elsewhere, which was probably the best outcome available to a man who had made the choices he'd made. Orrin Drake's situation was more complicated. The depth of his involvement, the duration, the specific intelligence he'd provided. And his arrangement with Solis was longer and harder negotiated, and the outcome was not clean, but it was an outcome with a shape to it rather than an open wound. Carver Lent's trial was scheduled for the following spring. He had excellent lawyers and they would delay it as long as they could delay it. But the case against him was the strongest case Solis had built in her career, and everyone involved understood how it would eventually resolve. The organization, Damian's organization, the second version, the reconstruction, was dismantled formally over 4 months. Some of it was surrendered through the cooperation process. Some of it Damian unwound himself, transaction by transaction, relationship by relationship, the careful and deliberate dismantling of something he'd spent 15 years building, which was its own kind of grief. Not for what the thing had been, because he'd known for longer than he'd admitted what the thing had been, but for the version of himself that had believed it was necessary. For the young man who'd decided that control was the only safe thing and had spent 2 decades building out from that decision in every direction. He sold 2 legitimate real estate holdings and a consulting company that had been legitimate from the beginning and used the proceeds to establish a private foundation. Housing, workforce development, the specific intersection of poverty and criminal exposure that he understood from the inside out. Elena ran it. She'd been moving towards something like this for years, he understood in retrospect. And when he came to her with the idea, she looked at him the way she sometimes looked at him, like she was seeing someone arrive somewhere she'd been waiting for them. He worked for the foundation. He was not its public face, for reasons that were self-evident, but he worked for it the way he'd worked for everything he'd ever committed to. Completely, without reservation, with the full application of capabilities that had been pointed in a different direction for most of his adult life, and turned out to translate surprisingly directly into the work of building things rather than protecting them. Claire was 3 months old the first time Marcus held her. He'd been granted a medical transfer closer to the city pending the appeal process, and the visit happened in a facility room with a corrections officer in the corner and fluorescent lighting and a table with chairs that wobbled slightly on the uneven floor. It was nothing like how Damian had imagined showing his daughter to his brother for the first time. It was better than he'd imagined because it was actual and real and happening, and Marcus held Claire with the careful hands of a man who hadn't been given many careful things recently and understood the value of the one he was holding. He looked down at her. He looked up at Damian. "She looks like you," he said. "Elena says she looks like her." "Elena's right," Marcus said, "but she also looks like you. The eyes." Damian looked at his daughter in his brother's arms and thought about the drive north of the city, the small building in the trees, the morning light on the wet gravel. The thing Vivian had said, "We start from zero." He hadn't known then what zero looked like. He was beginning to understand. Vivian left the city in November. She didn't announce it. She sent him a message through Solis's contact line, "Leaving tomorrow. Thank you for not making it impossible." He read it twice and then set the phone down on the kitchen counter, and Elena looked at him from across the room. "She's going," he said. Elena nodded. She'd known. They'd talked, he gathered, in the months since, in ways he wasn't fully party to and didn't need to be. Elena was that kind of person. She made room for complexity that other people simplified. He wrote back, "Take care of yourself." It was not enough, and it was too much, and it was the only thing he had that was accurate. She didn't reply, which was its own reply. He stood at the kitchen window of their apartment, a different apartment, smaller, different floor, a building with no particular history, and looked at the city. November, late afternoon, the sky doing the specific thing it did in November when the light ran out early and the buildings caught the last of it and held it for a moment before letting go. Claire was in the other room, in the rocking chair which they'd brought from the nursery in the old apartment along with the wooden stars that Elena had painted and Damian had not been able to leave behind. Elena was reading something. The apartment was warm and small enough that he could hear both of them from where he stood. The particular sound of a woman reading and a baby in a rocking chair doing whatever a 3-month-old does in a rocking chair, which was mostly breathing and making small sounds that had no content yet, but would have content soon. He looked at the city. He'd lived in this city his entire life. He'd wanted to own it when he was 23, and he'd come close enough that the difference between wanting and having had blurred for a long time. He understood now, standing at this window at 41, that the city had never been ownable. It had always just been the city, the thing that went on regardless, that held everyone's ambitions and fears and quiet, ordinary lives with perfect indifference, that kept moving when you were certain you'd made it still. He'd spent 20 years fighting that indifference. He wasn't sure yet what it meant to stop fighting it. He was learning. Elena appeared in the kitchen doorway with Claire against her shoulder, one hand at the back of the baby's head. She looked at him at the window and she read whatever was on his face. The thing she always read, the thing he'd stopped trying to hide from her somewhere in the last year. And she didn't say anything. She came and stood beside him, and they looked at the city together, the two of them, and the girl between them, the November light running out over the buildings. "She's going to want to know someday," Elena said quietly. "All of it. Who you were." "I know," he said. "What are you going to tell her?" He looked at the city. He thought about all the things that were true. The 20 years, the walls, the fractures, the drive he'd handed to Solis at 5 a.m. in an empty lobby. The drive north through the rain with Elena's hand in his brother's breathing loosening on a phone in a hospital hallway, the morning light on wet gravel. "The truth," he said, "when she's old enough." He paused. "All of it." Elena leaned slightly against him. Claire made a small sound against her shoulder. Not a complaint, not contentment, just the uncategorized expression of a new person trying out the fact of having a voice. Damian put his arm around Elena and looked out at the city and breathed. Outside, the last of the November light held itself against the buildings for one more moment. Then it let go, and the city moved on into evening, and the lights came up, and through the window the whole indifferent living thing glittered and shifted and kept going, the way it always had and always would, long past the ambitions of any single man who'd ever looked at it and decided he could hold it still. He couldn't. No one could. He understood now exactly the point